Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. In this video, we're going to talk about arrays. Now, to extend our analogy from earlier, you can think of an array as a bucket that contains other buckets. You declare an array just like any other variable with a data type and such. However, the array contains more than one value. Another way to think of it is like a sequence of data, and you can access any given item in that sequence given its index, or rather the position inside of the sequence, the array that you want to access. So what I want to do is create a quick example of an array in action, and we'll actually revisit this example a couple of times. The first time using a kind of longhand form, and then we'll start looking at variations of arrays. So I'm going to start creating a new project called Understanding Arrays. And again, just follow along as I type out this little code example. Notice the use of square brackets this time. Int square bracket space. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the declaration and the assignment of values inside of our array. First of all, you can see here in line number 12 that we're defining an array of integers. And just to point out a few things, you can see the use of square brackets as I pointed out a moment ago. The square brackets are used in the declaration to declare an array of type int called numbers. Then on that same line of code, we're defining the array of ints to have 5 values, or rather 5 elements, again using the square brackets to define the number of elements that will be in our array. So then in lines 13 through 17, we're setting the individual elements of the array to an integer value. So for example, let's look at line number 14. Numbers sub 1 equals the value 8. It means that in the second element of the array, store the numerical value 8. Now, it's extremely important to remember that arrays are zero-based, meaning that you count the element of the array starting with 0 as the first element. Quite honestly, this causes those who are new to software development a little bit of confusion. And we'll see what happens if you forget this fact in just a moment. By the way, whenever we use the square brackets in this capacity, we refer to them as the array or index access operator. Okay, it's what we'll use throughout to access a specific element of the array. Then in line number 19, we're retrieving the value that we placed into a specific element of the array, in this case, position 1, or in other words, the second element, and we're displaying it using a console.writeLine statement. So honestly, this last part, the toString part, is superfluous. As we learned before, console.writeLine can accept an integer value. It'll do the conversion necessary to print it to screen. I just wanted to show that we can use the toString method because what's returned from numbers sub 1 is an integer just like any other integer. There's nothing special about it per se. So now if we run the application, we'll see the number 8 is displayed. Again, why is that? Because we just picked a single item in our array to display in our console.writeLine. Alright, so let's have a little fun with this. What happens if we go here and we add a 6th item? So element 5 equals the value 42. Notice currently we don't get any squiggly lines. Everything looks great. We attempt to run the application and we get a runtime error that says index out of range exception. In other words, the index is out of range, it's out of bounds, to borrow a sports phrase. Let's do this. Let's stop the execution of the application and comment out that line of code. And also let's comment out that line of code too and move on. So the next thing I want to do is show how to use a for loop. And I use that tab twice to use the code snippet. Pretty neat. And under length, I'm going to do numbers, which is the name of our array, dot length. So this is a special property that will give us the total number of items that have been defined in our array. Inside of the code block, I'm going to go to console.writeLine and then numbers, and we'll open a square bracket and then use I. That's our iterator that we declared in the for declaration, and then we'll have toString here. All right, now if we run the application, we will iterate through all of the items in our array. Every one of the items in the sequence will be displayed to screen because of our for loop. So arrays and iteration statements like the for loop kind of go hand in hand. They're often used together. So the key notion here is that I now represents something meaningful. It's not just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's not just a number. It's rather one of the items in the sequence of our array. So I think that's the importance here. By assigning I to and equating it with the number of items in our array, we're able to use it in that capacity like we have here. Okay, so let's have some more fun. Let's comment out. In fact, I'm just going to select all of these and use the comment out button on our toolbar. Go right above the for loop, and I want to take a different approach at assigning initial values to each element of our array. All right, so we were able to duplicate at least 6 lines of code here in just one line of code by both declaring and then initializing the values for each element of our array using this open curly brace syntax, close curly brace, then using values, each of them an integer value, separated by commas. Will it work? Let's go ahead and run it again, and we get the exact same result. And so we're going to use a similar syntax to this when we work with a more full-featured version of arrays called collections. They're really not the same, but they kind of do the same sorts of things. We'll talk about collections a little bit later. Very important topic in .NET. So what I want you to notice, though, is the pattern. You'll start recognizing more patterns as you learn more about C# and see this is how arrays work, and this is kind of how collections work too, when we're able to declare and initialize all of the elements of an array as well as a collection in one line of code. Let's do this. Let's go below this and try a different example. We've been using integer values, but we can use it for any data type. And since we're using strings, let's go ahead and put in some names. And now we're going to use a different type of for statement. Now you probably guessed what this is going to do. We may have to come back and explain what it does though. So now in addition to our initial sequence that we used a for iteration statement, here we're using a for each to go through each item of our string. So as you can see, the for each statement, while it accomplishes something very similar, it's actually much simpler. And frankly, I use for each much more often because it works so well in this very scenario. For each simply iterates through the code block once for each element in the array. For each string inside of the names array, retrieve the value, store it in a variable called name, and then and that name will obviously be of type string, and then execute this code block. Easy. All right, so now we've seen how we can use for and for each to loop through arrays, but back to the topic of arrays. Whenever you store data inside of an array, you can perform many different built-in tasks using one of the methods that are available to arrays. And so a simple example is the array.reverse method. So let's do this. Let's write some more code. This is a famous historical quote. And now what we're going to do is create a different data type that we haven't looked at up to now, a character. In fact, we're going to create an array of characters, and characters kind of like strings, except where a string is a sequence of letters, a character is one letter, alphanumeric character. Okay, so what we're going to do is call this char array equals my text dot to char array. So the string data type has a method called toCharArray that will take each individual letter and put it into an array of characters. So now we have this char array, and we can do something neat like this. So what do you suppose this array.reverse does based on its name? It'll take each item in the array and it will reverse its order. So if we were to do something like this then, and this time we're going to use right instead of right line. So we don't want a line break in between each character. Okay, so let's run the application and see what happens. All right, so we've taken our text and we reversed the order. So if we were to read this backwards, now is the time for all good men to come to the aid of their country. Just backwards, okay? All right, so you can see that we have quite a few options. When it comes to working with arrays, it has some powerful features that we haven't quite explored yet, but we will continue to build on this knowledge as time goes on. All right, so in this lesson, we primarily learned about arrays as a means of storing groups of data like numbers or strings or even individual characters, as we've seen just now. Along the way, you learned about a few other important concepts as well as some techniques. First of all, you declare arrays by defining the data type and adding a pair of opening and closing square brackets. Then you can either declare the size of the array, or you can initialize the values in the array using that opening and closing curly brace syntax. Secondly, you use square brackets to access the individual elements of the array using a number inside of it, or a value that represents a number. Arrays are always zero-based, and attempting to access an array element that's outside of the boundary of the array's length, or rather the number of elements in the array, will cause an exception to be thrown, an out of bounds or an out of index exception. Fourth, you can use the length property to find out exactly how many elements are inside of a given array. So you can use this information to then iterate through each element in an array using a for iteration statement. Or, if you prefer, number 5, you can use a for each iteration statement to iterate through each element in an array, which also extracts the value of each element into its own variable. And then finally, you can call array.reverse to reverse the order of the elements inside of the array. Now, we use it in a very simple case where we just reverse the order of individual characters, but this would apply no matter what the array is used for. There are also many other types of operations like that you can perform on an array, and specifically the data inside of your particular array. Okay, so that's arrays. Learn more about them as time goes on. See you in the next video. Thank you.